Picture a tanker captain in the Gulf of Oman right now. He has 200,000 tons of crude oil beneath his feet, a crew of 23, and a set of orders from his company telling him not to move. The automatic identification system is on. The insurance policy that covered his voyage expired 48 hours ago. Lloyd's of London classified this corridor as a war zone. And somewhere behind the heat shimmer rising off the Persian Gulf, in a narrow strip of water just 21 miles across at its tightest point, there are Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast boats and anti-ship missile batteries pointed at vessels exactly like his. He is not moving. Neither are the roughly 200 other tankers anchored outside the Strait of Hormuz this morning, waiting. This is not a hypothetical. This is what April 6, 2026 looks like on the water. And yesterday, Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the country's highest military command authority, issued a statement that should have been the lead story on every financial network on Earth. The statement read, "If attacks on civilian targets are repeated, the next stages of our offensive and retaliatory operations will be much more devastating and widespread." That statement was not issued by a fringe militia. It was issued by Iran's formal military command structure. It was a direct response to U.S. President Donald Trump's public warning that Tuesday would be, and I am quoting him directly, Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. The word devastating in that Iranian statement is not bluster. It has a specific documented military meaning inside the IRGC's operational doctrine. And the moment you understand what Iran is actually threatening to do, the oil price at $109 per barrel today stops looking like a market anomaly and starts looking like a preview. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly three things. First, what Iran's devastating retaliation threat actually refers to in military terms, and what systems they have prepared to carry it out. Second, how the economic cascade from this threat is already hitting your gas prices, your grocery bill, and the cost of everything that moves by ship. And third, what the three most likely scenarios are from this moment forward, including the one that strategic analysts discuss privately, but governments will not name publicly. Stay with me, because the next 20 minutes will change how you read every headline coming out of the Middle East for the rest of this year. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated series of airstrikes on Iranian military facilities, nuclear sites, and government leadership. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei within the first hours. They degraded missile storage facilities, they damaged critical infrastructure, and they triggered a chain of events that has now produced the largest supply disruption in the recorded history of the global oil market. That is not my characterization. That is the International Energy Agency's. But to understand why February 28th happened, you have to go back a month further still, to the protests. Beginning in late December 2025, Iran experienced the largest domestic uprising since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. What started as economic frustration, the Iranian rial had collapsed to 5 million to the US dollar by early January, inflation ran at 42%, and food prices had risen 72% year on year, became something much larger. 5 million Iranians took to the streets. The government's response was one of modern history's bloodiest crackdowns on civilian protesters, with documented deaths ranging from 3,000 by the regime's own count to over 32,000 by some Iranian health officials. On January 2, 2026, President Trump had already threatened locked and loaded military intervention if the killing of protesters continued. The protests exposed what the second Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign had been designed to expose: a government whose currency, whose legitimacy, and whose security apparatus were all simultaneously under strain. In February, indirect nuclear negotiations began in Oman. The mediating Omani foreign minister described significant progress. Iran was reportedly prepared to make real concessions. And then, while those talks were still active, the strikes began. Iranian officials rejected claims that they had been preparing an imminent attack. The IAEA confirmed it had found no evidence of an organized nuclear weapons program at the time the war started. The strike happened anyway. Iran's response was immediate. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles struck Israeli cities, U.S. military bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Jordan. On March 3rd, an IRGC commander declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to vessels traveling to or from the United States, Israel, and allied nations. Within 72 hours, roughly 70% of tanker traffic had evaporated. By March 10th, it was effectively zero. On March 18th, in a move that widened the conflict significantly, Israel struck Iran's South Pars natural gas field, the largest natural gas field on Earth, in coordination with U.S. forces. Iran retaliated by striking Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility, the single largest liquefied natural gas production site in the world, responsible for 20% of global LNG supply. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports. LNG spot prices in Asia more than doubled in a single session to 40 per million British thermal units. Then came the petrochemical facility. Then the IRGC intelligence chief, Majid Kademi, killed in an airstrike. Then Israeli missiles striking residential buildings in Haifa, killing civilians on both sides. Then Kuwait and the UAE activating air defenses simultaneously on the morning of April 6th. The Iran that existed before February 28th is not coming back. What is happening now is something qualitatively different from any prior episode of Iran-US-Israel tension. And the devastating retaliation threat issued this morning is not the beginning of this story. It is, in many ways, the threshold crossing that everyone feared. That threshold has now been crossed. Let me put this in concrete terms. When Iran's military command threatens much more devastating and widespread operations, what do they actually have available to carry that out? The answer involves at least 3 distinct weapons categories, and each one tells you something different about Iran's strategic doctrine. The first and most widely discussed is the ballistic missile inventory. Iran's Sejil missile is a solid-fueled, 2-stage ballistic missile with a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers, capable of reaching anywhere in Israel and throughout the Gulf. Unlike liquid-fueled missiles, solid fuel systems require no on-the-pad preparation time. They can be launched from concealed mobile launchers within minutes of an order. Iran also maintains the Imad, a precision-guided variant of the Shahab 3 with a range of 1,700 kilometers, and the Khaybar-Shikan, a medium-range ballistic missile that Iran publicly tested in 2022 and has since deployed operationally. In the 6 weeks since the war began, Iran has launched hundreds of these against Israeli cities and U.S. bases. Israel's Arrow 3 interceptor system, designed to engage ballistic missiles outside the atmosphere, has been the primary line of defense. On April 6th, the Israeli Defense Ministry approved an emergency procurement deal with Israel Aerospace Industries to accelerate Arrow interceptor production specifically because the current rate of use is straining inventories. Here is something no military analyst had seen demonstrated at this scale in modern history before this conflict: the simultaneous saturation of multiple advanced air defense systems across different countries using coordinated drone missile combination attacks. When Iran strikes Israel, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar in overlapping windows, it forces each country's defense network to manage its own saturation problem independently, while Iran's command structure watches for gaps in real time. The second category is anti-ship capability, and this is where the devastating language gets its most specific meaning. The IRGC Navy operates the Noor, a domestically produced anti-ship cruise missile with a range of 170 kilometers, derived from the Chinese C-802. It flies at sea-skimming altitude to evade radar. They also operate the Khalij Fars, a ballistic anti-ship missile that enters its terminal phase in a near-vertical dive, which makes interception geometry extremely difficult for conventional naval defense systems. In the Strait of Hormuz itself, geography is Iran's greatest ally. The shipping lanes are only about 3 kilometers wide each direction. An anti-ship missile launched from Iranian coastal batteries does not need to fly far. It needs to fly accurately. What military strategists are actually saying, and this is the part the news coverage is missing, is that Iran's declared threat against civilian energy infrastructure represents a doctrinal shift from primarily targeting military assets to placing the global energy system itself in the crosshairs. The IRGC has posted satellite imagery and named specific targets: the Stargate AI data center in Abu Dhabi, which has American shareholders. It declared that all ICT companies in the region will be considered legitimate targets. This is not random escalation. It is a structured message about what comes next if U.S. strikes on Iranian power plants and bridges proceed. The third category is the one the public discourse least understands: mines. Iran has an extensive inventory of naval mines, including the EM-52, a rocket-propelled mine that fires upward when it detects a vessel's acoustic or pressure signature. The Strait of Hormuz is shallow enough and narrow enough that a determined mining operation could make transit dangerous, not just for commercial shipping, but for naval escorts attempting to clear a path. The U.S. Navy's Millennium Challenge 2002 war game, a classified exercise that simulated a conflict with an unnamed Middle Eastern adversary widely understood to represent Iran, demonstrated conclusively that geography heavily favors the defending force in this waterway. The simulation results were controversial enough that the exercise was reset and the outcomes altered. The underlying tactical reality it identified has not changed. What changed this week is the explicit threat to civilian infrastructure in response to Trump's civilian infrastructure ultimatum. Before this, Iran's strikes had been primarily at military and quasi-military targets. The much more devastating statement describes a doctrine of mutual civilian infrastructure destruction, and the capability to execute it on desalination plants in Kuwait and Qatar, on LNG terminals, on power grids across the Gulf, is not hypothetical. Iran has already struck some of these targets. The threat is that what has happened so far is the restrained version. Watch the Arrow interceptor production rate. Watch the desalination plant security situation in Kuwait and Qatar. Watch whether the Houthis in Yemen make good on their stated option to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. If those three things move simultaneously, every energy analyst's worst-case scenario becomes the base case. Let me now examine what all of this has already done to the global economy, because this is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from an IRGC statement posted on Telegram to the price of gasoline in your city. Start with the immediate market reaction. Brent crude opened today at approximately $109 per barrel. That is roughly 65% higher than pre-war levels, when it sat around $66 at the end of 2025. When the Strait closed in early March, the first surge pushed prices past $120 before strategic reserve releases brought them back. The IEA coordinated a release of 400 million barrels of emergency oil from member nation stockpiles, the largest coordinated release in the organization's history. Energy strategists described it as a small bandage on a large wound. The math explains why. Global daily petroleum consumption runs at approximately 105 million barrels per day. 400 million barrels covers fewer than 4 days of total world consumption and about 20 days of normal Hormuz flows. The release bought time. It did not solve the structural problem. The transmission mechanism from military escalation to your household runs through 3 channels, and each one is compounding the others. Channel 1 is direct energy cost. Gasoline prices in the United States have already risen above $4 per gallon, their highest since late 2023, despite the U.S. being a net energy exporter. The reason is that oil is a globally priced commodity. When Brent crude rises, U.S. benchmark WTI follows. The crack spread, the refining margin between crude and finished fuel, widens in a supply shock, which means even domestic producers pass through higher prices at the pump. Channel 2 is shipping cost. Maritime insurers at Lloyd's of London, Allianz, and Zurich have classified the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding waters as a war zone, the highest possible risk classification. Insuring a single very large crude carrier through the region now costs hundreds of thousands of dollars more per transit than it did in January. Companies that still attempt to route ships around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 10 to 14 days to voyage time, are paying both the time cost and the fuel surcharge. Those costs are embedded in the price of every product that travels by container ship, meaning electronics, clothing, pharmaceuticals, agricultural equipment, everything. Channel 3 is the fertilizer link, and this is the one that keeps food system analysts awake. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizer, urea, ammonia, diammonium phosphate, normally transits the Strait of Hormuz. The Persian Gulf accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports. Since the closure, Middle Eastern granular urea prices have already risen approximately 20% compared to late February levels. Because nitrogen fertilizer production relies on natural gas as its primary feedstock, the LNG price surge following the Ras Laffan strike compounded production costs further. Analysts estimate that global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher through the first half of 2026 if the crisis persists. And fertilizer price spikes historically translate into food price increases with a lag of 3 to 6 months, precisely the window we are now entering. Now let us look at the countries most exposed. Japan is arguably the single most vulnerable major economy. It relies on the Strait of Hormuz for approximately 75% of its total oil imports and holds about 254 days of oil in strategic reserves. A figure that sounds comfortable until you recall that reserves exist to be drawn down, not replenished, during a closure. Japan has already declared an energy emergency for the first time since the 2011 Fukushima disaster, is drawing reserves at 500,000 barrels per day, and has initiated emergency restarts of nuclear reactors that were offline. The Japanese yen has fallen 4% against the dollar since the crisis began. South Korea faces a near-identical structural problem, sourcing roughly 60% of its oil via the strait. The Kospi recorded its largest single-day drop in modern history, 12%, on March 4th. Samsung and Hyundai have announced 15% production cuts. For a country whose tech and automotive sectors are deeply embedded in global supply chains, those cuts reverberate globally. India, sourcing approximately 50% of its crude and 53% of its LNG from Gulf sources transiting the strait, has seen a 12% domestic petrol price hike that has triggered nationwide protests of its own. The Reserve Bank of India held an emergency rate meeting and raised rates by 50 basis points, a sign of how seriously New Delhi is treating the inflation risk. China's position is more nuanced. Beijing holds approximately 2 billion barrels of crude stockpiles, providing roughly 108 days of import cover even at zero new inflows. Its structural reliance on coal limits proportional oil dependency, and there is credible reporting that Iranian-flagged or Chinese-flagged vessels have continued limited transits. Iran has economic reasons to maintain China's access even if it closes the strait to everyone else. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed, because the downstream food and goods inflation from this disruption is still 3 to 4 months from showing up fully in the consumer price data. The Philippines has declared a state of emergency. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, and Vietnam are facing severe fuel shortages. And across Gulf Cooperation Council states, 70% of food imports were disrupted by mid-March, because these countries import over 80% of their caloric intake through the same strait that is now effectively closed. Iranian strikes on desalination plants, which provide 99% of drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar, have shifted the humanitarian dimension from fiscal to existential. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is a direct line from Iranian missile doctrine to the price of bread in your grocery store. Let us now examine who is talking to whom, and more importantly, who is not. The United States' public position is unambiguous. Trump's ultimatum, reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face strikes on power plants and bridges beginning Tuesday, is simultaneously a military threat and a domestic political performance. The administration has offered diverse and changing justifications for the original strikes, preempting Iranian retaliation, destroying missile capabilities, preventing nuclear development, securing oil resources, achieving regime change. What is notable is not the breadth of justifications, but the internal contradiction between them. A government seeking regime change and a government seeking a deal to reopen a shipping lane are not running the same operation. That tension between stated goals and operational reality defines Washington's current strategic incoherence on this file. Iran's public position is equally hardened. Tehran has stated it will not pause its attacks until the U.S. agrees to financial reparations and guarantees it will not be attacked again. Privately, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has framed the energy infrastructure threats as consequences that will stretch beyond the region, which is a diplomatic signal, not purely a military one. It is saying the cost of escalation falls on the entire global system, not just on U.S. allies. That framing is designed to pressure Europe, China, Japan, and South Korea to push Washington toward a negotiated off-ramp. That brings us to the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, whose position is one of studied ambiguity. They have activated air defenses. They have been targeted by Iranian strikes. And yet neither has formally joined the U.S.-Israeli coalition. The reason is structural. The Gulf states' entire economic model depends on oil exports that transit the same strait Iran has closed. Any scenario that results in prolonged conflict destroys their revenue base. Saudi Arabia has been diverting oil exports through the East-West pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, a workaround with a maximum capacity of 5 million barrels per day against a Hormuz closure affecting 20 million. China is the actor with the most leverage that is using the least of it publicly. Beijing abstained from the March 11th UN Security Council resolution demanding Iran cease attacks on Arab states. China absorbs approximately 80% of Iran's crude exports, which means Beijing has more financial influence over Tehran's decision-making than any other external actor. What China needs to tell its domestic audience is that it avoided being drawn into a US-led war. What it needs privately is the strait reopened. The gap between those two imperatives explains why Beijing's mediation has been quiet and thus far ineffective. The unexpected mediator worth watching is Oman. Oman brokered the February nuclear talks, and the Omani foreign minister had declared significant progress before those talks collapsed with the strikes. Oman is one of the only countries with formal diplomatic channels to both Washington and Tehran that it has not closed. Muscat is the back channel that a negotiated resolution, if one happens, will likely run through. The fundamental problem is this. Iran needs to be able to tell its domestic audience that the military sacrifice produced something real: reparations, security guarantees, international accountability for the strikes. The U.S. needs to be able to tell its domestic audience that Iran blinked. These two domestic narrative requirements are, at this moment, functionally incompatible. That incompatibility is why the 45-day ceasefire draft proposal delivered to both sides has produced no agreement. Strategic analysts are currently working through exactly 3 plausible trajectories from this moment. Here's what each one actually requires and what it costs. A negotiated resolution is possible, but requires each side to make concessions that are domestically painful in the extreme. For Iran, it means accepting some form of ceasefire without the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the U.S. and Israel that hardline elements of the regime consider essential. For the U.S., it means stepping back from Trump's Tuesday ultimatum without appearing to have capitulated, which is a political problem of the first order for an administration that framed this entire intervention in maximalist terms. For the deal to work, Oman almost certainly has to facilitate a private commitment from Washington that civilian infrastructure strikes are off the table in exchange for Iran allowing commercial shipping to resume, while Iran publicly frames this as conditions met, and Washington publicly says nothing. The strait reopens, tankers resume transit within 48 to 72 hours, and Brent crude falls back below $80 within 2 weeks. This is technically achievable. The diplomatic architecture for it exists. But it requires both leaders to accept a face-saving ambiguity that neither has shown willingness to embrace publicly. This is the scenario the market is currently pricing. Neither side escalates to the threshold of strikes on Iranian power plants or a formal declaration of total warfare, but neither side de-escalates either. The strait remains effectively closed to most commercial traffic. IRGC fast boats continue harassing vessels attempting transit. U.S. Navy escorts provide some protection for a trickle of tankers, 3 to 4 per day by most operational estimates. Oil prices stay in the $100 to $120 range. Every week of this scenario costs the global economy the compounding effects described in the previous section. Fertilizer prices rising, food inflation building in the pipeline, industrial output falling in Japan, South Korea, and India, and the Gulf states' fiscal models deteriorating in real time. For Iran, attrition is also painful. The country's oil exports are a shadow of pre-war levels, its currency is under further pressure, and the internal protests have not stopped. But the IRGC calculates that the West will exhaust political patience before Iran exhausts its military options in this geography. That calculation has historical precedent on its side. This scenario extends for weeks to months, and its economic damage compounds non-linearly with time. This is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. It requires a trigger, and that trigger is now within 24 to 48 hours of potentially arriving in the form of Trump's Tuesday deadline. Here's the specific sequence. The U.S. strikes Iranian power plants and bridges. Iran's military command, having publicly committed to much more devastating retaliation, carries through coordinated strikes on Gulf desalination infrastructure, power grids across multiple GCC states, and, most critically, an attempt to mine the Strait of Hormuz using the EM-52 system. Simultaneously, the Houthis in Yemen act on their stated option to close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. If that happens, the Saudi pipeline alternative through Yanbu loses its access to export markets. An analyst at the Middle East Insider estimated that a dual closure of Hormuz and Bab al-Mandeb would push oil prices to $180 to $200 per barrel. The IAEA has already warned that continued military activity near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, which has been struck within 75 meters of its perimeter, risks a severe radiological accident with consequences beyond Iran's borders. That is not a fringe concern. That is the Director General of the IAEA. Here's the thing. The headlines aren't telling you. In this third scenario, the global insurance and shipping system does not gradually adjust. It freezes. The cascading food, energy, and pharmaceutical disruptions that are currently building slowly would accelerate to crisis speed across the developing world simultaneously. This is not a scenario anyone in any government is publicly naming. But it is the scenario that every serious risk desk in every major financial institution is currently stress testing. Let me connect this back to your life directly. Watch the price on your gas pump receipt. Watch the electricity bill that arrives next month. Watch the price of groceries, bread, cooking oil, rice, at your local store over the next 90 days. Watch the price of any item that was manufactured in South Korea, Japan, or anywhere that depends on affordable energy to run a production line. Each of these numbers is not set by your local economy. It is set right now in a 21-mile wide strip of water between Iran and Oman. Because here is what this moment actually is in historical terms. The 1973 Arab oil embargo lasted 5 months. It moved through roughly 5 million barrels per day. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now involves 20 million barrels per day, 4 times the volume, and it is already in its 6th week. The IEA has called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The Gulf Cooperation Council's economic model, built on oil exports and food imports transiting the same waterway, is facing a systemic stress test it was never designed to survive at this duration. The 2026 crisis is not just a military confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran. It is a stress test of every assumption the global economy made about the stability of Gulf energy corridors. Every supply chain that was built on the premise that oil would always flow through Hormuz. Every reserve calculation that assumed the crisis would be short. Every diplomatic framework that believed back-channel negotiations were always available as an off-ramp. All of those assumptions are now under live examination. And here is the genuine open question, not a cliffhanger, but the honest uncertainty at the center of this story that no analyst has been able to answer with confidence. Iran is now led by Mojtaba Khamenei, appointed as the new supreme leader after his father's assassination. He is younger, less tested, less predictable, and facing both an external war and internal protests that are still ongoing despite brutal crackdowns. The question is not whether Trump will issue the Tuesday ultimatum. He already has. The question is what decision a new, unproven supreme leader of a cornered Islamic Republic makes in the next 48 hours when the bombs begin to fall on Iranian bridges and power plants. History's most dangerous moments have rarely been the ones where veteran leaders made calculated decisions. They have been the ones where new leaders, under maximum pressure, felt they could not afford to be seen as weak. Watch that decision space carefully. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.